In the summer of 1981, one rural family found their home under siege by supernatural forces that none of them understood. Although researchers arrived on the property to help determine the nature of these disturbances, the events that unfolded on their farm were simply far too bizarre to categorize. And now, nearly 45 years later, we are no closer to answers. The only thing we can do is preserve their testimony as it was first presented, a story filled with monsters, mutilation, and strange lights seen in the woods. You won't want to miss this one. I mean, really, you won't want to miss this one. Robert and his family lived on a quaint farm in the community of Rome, Ohio. And here, they had a pleasant life, raising poultry and minding their own business. But in 1981, things started to take a turn for the worse. The events that Robert and his family suffered through were recorded in Night Siege, an out-of-print book written by researcher and author Dennis Pilichis. For some reason, this terrifying story has gone mostly overlooked by people in the paranormal community, which is why I'm bringing it to you today. One thing to remember though, the story of Robert's family unfolds over the entire summer of 1981, so I'm going to have to move fast and compress some things if we want to cover it all, but I promise it's worth it. Things began in early 1981. A deer was discovered on Robert's property. Its sides slashed open as if by the claws of some gigantic unseen predator. It was the beginning of a mystery that, if still unsolved, would be at least reveal more hints as the year continued on. The next thing worth noting occurred in May of 1981. With Robert's permission, a group of Amish men arrived on his property to cut some wood, and they brought with them around 600 pounds of feed to sustain the horses that would help haul out the timber. But when they returned to the site the next day, the bags were shredded and emptied, just like the unfortunate deer that had been discovered. The Amish didn't know what to make of it, but continued operations, hauling more feed out to Robert's property. On that day, Robert heard gunfire from the woods, and when the Amish came out for the evening, he saw that one of their horses had a gaping wound on its side as well, but its owners wouldn't let on that anything unusual had happened. They simply said that they had been shooting at snakes, that's all. Still, the visitors to Robert's property kept working, that is, until one day when they suddenly stopped. Not only that, but they had abandoned all their equipment and didn't come back for it until over a month later. Please, like they didn't know something was going on. It was weird, to say the least. Now, going forward, you see, the winter before, Robert had installed a gas well on his property. But it wasn't until June that the gas line was installed in the woods. And as it turns out, a bulldozer operator on the property stumbled across something truly strange. A patch of land 40 feet wide, completely empty. And I mean completely. No vegetation, no rocks, nothing. The only thing there was to see were two pairs of holes, each about the size of a 50-gallon drum, bored into the ground. When Robert heard about this, he asked the driver of the bulldozer what he planned to do, and the man's response, "I didn't get paid to go around, I get paid to go through." Well, it was around this same time on June 15th that Robert started to notice animals on his farm disappearing. All in all, 4 ducks and a chicken had disappeared into the woods, but they didn't vanish without a trace. Their bodies were eventually recovered. In each case, the heads were torn off, their stomachs removed with one gigantic bite from some large animal. Robert quietly buried the birds, but as he did so, he also discovered something strange, much closer to the house. A large pile of sawdust that looked like something had been digging into it. The cherry on top of all of this is that before activity really took off on the property, there was an incident involving Robert's son. The 16-year-old had woken up in the middle of the night screaming in terror. He swore that he had awoken to find his face staring into his bedroom window. Everyone dismissed it as a nightmare, of course, but the entire family would soon come to share in this nightmare. Now, needless to say, things were odd on the farm at this point, and everyone realized it. But no one had any idea how strange they would get. Late on the night of June 25th, 1981, Robert and his sons were at home when they noticed a commotion among their ducks. There, in the front yard by the pine tree, they were shuffling around and flapping their wings, obviously agitated by something. And now, Robert is remembering everything that's happened until this point. And he knows that it all points to a big predator lurking somewhere on the property. And there, scuttling just beyond the beam of his flashlight, seems to be a shape. He can't make out any details other than the fact that it's massive. It's moving around on four legs and, most notably, has a pair of big, red, glowing eyes that are fixed on the flock of ducks. Well, immediately, he passes his flashlight to his son and takes aim. He scores a direct hit on the shape in the darkness using the eyes as a guide. Robert knows it was a direct hit because a blood-curdling shriek issued from this thing. That, and it took off running across the field at an incredible speed, too fast to get off a second shot. And even in the darkness, they could tell that it was enormous. But it hadn't run away on all fours. It stood up to run across the field on 2 feet, and clearly stood taller than any man, around 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, Robert and his boys stayed up most of the night. They weren't even worried about the ducks anymore. They were worried about themselves. The next night, Robert couldn't sleep, so instead of tossing and turning, he had gone out to the living room to watch some TV. Around 2 in the morning, the family dog started barking outside. On a rural farm, this wasn't all that unusual. It had probably just caught sight of an animal that it wanted to catch, and so Robert turned down the volume on the TV set. As he did so, the barking stopped. Everything fell deathly quiet, and then the dog began whimpering and crying in terror. Robert immediately shot up from where he was sitting and scrambled to the back of the house, grabbing a flashlight on the way. He threw open the back door, passed the beam over the yard, and he saw his dog right away. It was trying to dig a hiding place underneath his push mower. And so Robert yells out to the dog, but it was no use. The animal was absolutely terrified. And this sinking feeling fell over Robert. He couldn't help but remember what happened the night before, and he swiveled the beam of his flashlight over the rest of the yard and then the wooden farm hoist he had constructed. And that was when he saw it. The large, shaggy shape was bigger than they had estimated. The top beams of the hoist were 12 feet tall, and the top of its head was no more than 3 feet lower than that. And it was covered head to toe in dark brown or black hair. It had a pair of these red eyes about the size of a baseball. And in the light of his flashlight, he could make out that the face he hadn't been able to see the night before. It looked like a cross between a person and a gorilla with this oversized, flattened nose. Below that, a thick-lipped mouth held a pair of shark-like fangs that protruded from its bottom jaw. Robert said that it was less than 30 feet away, making snorting and growling sounds, and he thought he was going to have a heart attack. And so after taking in as many details as he could bear, Robert scrambled back inside, yelling for his sons to get out of bed, get dressed, and get down there as quick as they could. And within moments, they were at his side, and Robert had grabbed his shotgun. Since they could hear this at the rear of the house, they snuck out the front door and piled in the pickup truck. Robert brought the vehicle around to the rear of the house, and there in the distance by the tree line, their headlights caught a glimpse of this thing. It skirted along the edge of the forest beside the road, so the family hit the highway, so to speak. But the chase didn't last very long. They made an effort to follow the thing as far as they could, but lost it. Passing the nearest neighbor's house half a mile down the road, they saw a car idling in the driveway. They asked their neighbor if they had seen anything, but if they had, the neighbor denied it. Robert and his sons decided they'd lost sight of the thing for good, so they headed back towards the house. Along the way, they kept their windows down and drove slow. they could still hear something out there among the thick trees, but never saw it again. And that was when the engine stopped running. No reason. The gas tank was full, the truck had been running fine moments earlier, and now it was dead as a doornail. Luckily, another neighbor passed by them and asked what they were doing in the middle of the road. And Robert admitted the crazy things they had been seeing on his property. The neighbor didn't seem very surprised. He admitted that his own sons now refused to camp in their backyard because they had seen what they heard or thought was a bear earlier in the summer. But now, everyone is wondering, was it really a bear? And now this entire time, Robert's trying to restart the truck. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the truck coughed to life again. The whole family stayed up that night, waiting for this thing to come back. It never did. But their vigil gave them plenty of time to think about what had happened. Surely it was just a coincidence that they had seen the creature and then the truck had died, right? Right? And so 2 nights later, the events on the farm had everyone on edge to the point that they were afraid to leave the house at all. In fact, they had even canceled plans. Robert and his boys were musicians and had booked an opportunity to play music at a community gathering, but now nothing could convince anyone to leave the house. And for good reason, because this thing came back. And folks, it brought friends. By now, everyone is watching the tree line for any sign of movement. When it got really late, they started to perceive what seemed to be dark shapes lurking around the edge of the woods, near the field out back. Everyone was scared at first, and then they got mad. This was their house. The ducks and chickens were theirs too, and whatever this thing was, if it was left to do its business, it could ruin them. Robert and his boys, fully armed, marched outside. One of Robert's sons saddled up on the tractor, cranked it up, and headed out into the field, his family members pacing him, flashlights fixed on the trees. But the closer they got, the more they realized that they didn't need flashlights, because whatever it was in the woods had its own light. It was hard to see much, but everyone agreed that one of the dark shapes in the forest seemed to be waving a light back and forth. It looked like it was a dark blue. One of the family members tried to take aim, but the moment he raised his firearm, the light went out. And then, from deeper in the woods, the red eyes appeared. But not just one, multiple pairs, all staring back at them from between the tree trunks. And Robert and his sons have had it. Time to show these things they mean business. They just open fire with all their might, unloading their shotguns into the trees. When the dust settles, they've used up 2 full boxes of 12-gauge shells. So they all stand there, listening to the tractor idle and wondering where these intruders went. They start spinning around in circles, trying to get a bearing on their next course of action. And that's when somebody shouts, "There's something down by the pond." Everyone rushes to the side of the tractor. They train their flashlights in the direction of the pond and immediately catch one of the creatures by the water's edge. Without saying anything, someone opens fire. The thing tumbles into the murky water belly first, and the whole family just keeps on blasting. And while they're doing it, they notice that the other eyes in the forest have dropped low to the ground as if they're trying to hide. Finally, everyone stops to reload. But as they do, one of those sets of eyes darts out from the forest, scuttles to the edge of the pond, and jumps in the water. They can't see much, but there's a commotion. When they finally train their lights back on the water, it's sloshing violently, but the body of these things is nowhere to be seen. That's when Robert and his boys realize something. They're almost out of ammo. They're far from the house, and whatever these things are, they don't seem bothered by shotguns. Everyone beats it back to the house as fast as their legs will carry them. They cower inside all night, just catching glimpses of things in the distance. Luckily, nothing seems to bother them. Another night has passed with everyone alive. It's around this time that Dennis Pilichis enters the picture. He arrives at the farm and immediately starts looking for footprints. and he soon finds them, but as you can see from this picture, they're absolutely bizarre. Round impressions with only 3 toes apiece, spread about 6 feet apart. Stranger still, the trackways would continue for a time and then disappear, only to pick up again a while later. Dennis starts asking the family more questions. It seems as if whatever was holding the blue light was different than the other things with the red eyes. And not only that, but in addition to the light it held, these other figures seemed to have a soft white glow barely outlining their bodies. Over the coming days, Dennis and his fellow researchers would see this firsthand. This is part of what makes Night Siege so fascinating. It isn't just a story handed down over the years. Dennis and several outside observers were on site for some of it and saw some of this stuff firsthand. That doesn't happen very often in stories like this. Dennis wrote this:
"Even though a complete mystery, almost everyone has seen these events, sometimes confirming events as they happen from different locations. This confirms something is being seen that has some sort of dimension to it and not merely some sort of reflection. These strange light sources and mysterious black forms are a common thread among many UFO and creature encounters. One night, 3 members of the research team saw the backwoods light up as bright as day. The glow was a pure and clear white color. The woods grew bright 3 times in a 5-minute period."
There's also a paper trail from law enforcement testifying to the experiences of Robert and his sons. On June 29th, the family brought in police officers in addition to Dennis's team. They filed 2 police reports, which they categorized as suspicious activity. 2 days later, the family had settled into a new nighttime routine. They would climb onto their roof, firearms in hand, and wait for the intruders to arrive. The night of July 1st was no different in that regard, although the phenomenon put in quite a show that night, and it got even weirder. While keeping watch, 2 family members noticed something hovering over the trees. They described 4 objects or lights, all spaced evenly above the treetops. They changed colors from red to blue to yellow, and then, oddly enough, something that seemed more like black. Each one was enormous, about the size of a basketball if you held it at arm's length, although they were shaped more like boxes than spheres. On one occasion, one of these objects shot down a white beam of light somewhere inside the tree line, making the interior of the forest as bright as day. Everyone watched, mouths open, as the bizarre sight lit up the entirety of the woods. But any awe they felt was immediately replaced by terror because somewhere out there in the woods, a sound welled up. But it wasn't a calm, eerie moan or a long, protracted howl. It was manic. It was what sounded like a woman in distress screaming from somewhere deeper in the forest. And then, without warning, the lights above the trees blinked out. The sudden shift from brightness to absolute darkness left everyone unable to see for a moment or two. And when their eyes recovered, they spotted what seemed to be more of these shadowy figures running just inside the forest, clear enough to see but well out of the effective range of their shotguns. All the family members could do was watch and stare. It got to be too much, so the watchmen on the roof went back inside and retrieved their rifles. Once back up top, the family started taking pot shots at the intruders, but after a while, they started to get a sinking feeling. None of these shapes had any glowing eyes. Those stayed inside the forest. These other shadow figures, on the other hand, would dart into the field. Each time a hit was scored on one of these shapes, it would scream, but the red eyes never moved. They seemed to be watching, waiting from just beyond the trees. Were the shapes in the field nothing more than a distraction? Is this story weird enough for you? Because it's about to get weirder. Dennis wrote this.
While up on the roof, later, they noticed 2 forms with red glowing eyes come up this side of the field and stand to the side of the barn. They tried to talk to them from up on the roof, waited 5 minutes, and then lowered the boom on them. They screamed, yelled, and ran off. At one point during the night, while taking turns shooting at these forms as they ran around on the woodline, they looked out again and saw their horse standing there out in the field. At this time, their horse was locked up in the barn, did not get out, and was not out in that field. But the form looked like his horse. They knew something was wrong and that even though it was their horse out there, it was not their horse.
Realizing that this was yet another distraction, the family unloaded on the phantom horse, which was well within range. As with the other shadow figures, the shape screamed, this time running off to the northeast part of the field. A quick inspection of the field shortly thereafter revealed that their hunch had proven correct. There was no blood anywhere to be found, just a few indistinct points in the ground. Their horse was locked up tight. It had been some sort of bizarre decoy perpetrated by whatever had invaded the farm. So everyone heads back up to the roof. They stay there until around 3:30 in the morning, when another light appears above a cornfield across the street. It shot a beam of light that one of the boys said hit him in the head, causing him to lose his balance and almost tumble off the roof. The other responded by opening fire on the light, which instantly extinguished. The boy hit with the light blacked out for a moment, but thankfully regained consciousness, even if he was left with a headache that stretched into the following day. And then, about an hour after this, something like a red-hot coal, but bigger in size, drifted down from the sky and landed among the branches of a nearby tree to the east, directly across the street from the cornfield above which the light had appeared earlier. Now again, the family isn't taking any prisoners at this point. They take a few shots at the light. Ready for more? Here's what Dennis wrote.
It jumped down a branch and turned into a small animal-like creature, something like an owl. They continued to shoot at it. It continued to jump down a branch until it fell out of the tree onto the ground. At this point, the thing got up and ran down the woodline on all fours. The family ran over to the tree, which was almost directly on the woodline, and saw a depression in the soft field grass where it looked like something heavy had fallen out of the tree onto the ground, leaving an obvious impression.
Now, this is just getting weird, right? This is crazy. This is all in addition to a cigar box-shaped object that seemed to silently fly by at one point, complete with red and blue lights. Robert was the one to take aim at it this time, and his shot was followed by the sound of breaking glass. The object then reappeared later over the trees. More shadow figures appeared throughout the night. Hey, I told you there was a lot to cover today. We ain't over yet. Now, it might be easy to think that this is all just a tall tale, but remember, Dennis Pilichis visited the property regularly during this period and even saw some of these things himself. The events were also accompanied by physical evidence, like the footprints. The events of July 1st yielded additional tracks from which casts were made. What's more, eyewitnesses around Rome, Ohio were having their own sightings during this time period, although none of them were half as dramatic as what Robert and his family experienced. The encounters continued, though, nothing quite like the first night in July. Off and on, family members, including Robert, would see these large, dark shapes outside that would dart away from the house as soon as they were spotted. Robert eventually put up barbed wire around the front yard, hoping that might keep these things at bay. Now, some of the weirdest evidence that Dennis collected were not just the 3-toed footprints, but regular 5-toed footprints surrounded by something odd.
The strange thing about this find was that the field grass was swirled around the footprint impressions in a clockwise direction. It was one of the strangest things I had ever seen. We found 5 prints which exhibited these swirl effect around each print. The prints were spaced 6 feet apart. When the tractor path prints veered off into the clearing and field, they left a normal broken path, which did not have the mysterious swirl effect.
Dennis Piliches and area researchers had what they described as an intense experience while on Robert's property on July 6th. They said that a glowing form clearly stepped out of the forest on the opposite side of the field. Members of the family opened fire like they always did, dropping the shape into the tall grass. Dennis and the other investigators rushed to where the figure had fallen, but it took a little longer than they would have liked because they had to hop on an electrical fence. And when they reached the area, they saw clear signs that something had indeed been brought down there. There was a large impression in the grass and another path heading away from the site, as if something had dragged itself along the ground, but predictably, no body. Dennis and another researcher began pelting the forest with rocks, trying to elicit a response. It didn't take long for another rock to come whizzing out of the trees, flying past their heads and landing at the feet of the family 15 feet behind them. Around this time, those familiar glowing red lights started popping up all through the forest to the east of the house, prompting everyone to retreat back inside. For the rest of the night, they saw figures outlined in a dim glow, as well as those red eyes playing hide and seek off in the distance. Their height off the ground varied from just a few feet to 12 feet in the air. Then, around 3 a.m. on the morning of July 7th, Dennis saw something that truly impressed him. He said this:
"The best sighting we all had this night was when 3 sets of big, red glowing eyes were observed, one to the left, one behind the dead tree, and one lower, almost on the ground. The bigger creature was over 12 feet tall, judging from the dead tree trunk, and stepped out and stood to the left of the tree. My flashlight beam was right on it at this time, and the body of the creature actually casting a shadow on the big dead tree trunk. Black hair could be seen shining in the light of the flashlight from the creature's body. Everyone fired at it. All the critter did was turn sideways with a strange sort of motion and moved out of the flashlight beam. The shooting did not appear to have any sort of effect at all. After the bigger creature moved away, I had the flashlight beam directly on the red glowing-eyed face of the one to the right that was almost on the ground for almost a full minute or two. I will never forget this experience. I actually then saw it sort of crawl away, moving back into the woods."
Dennis noted that no matter how much firepower the family used, the eyes didn't really seem to care. It was only the shadow figures that reacted, and even they seemed to be putting on a theatrical production more than actually getting hurt by anything. Things started to taper off a little bit by August. There were still plenty of sightings, but everything seemed to get as normal as it got nowadays. Another chicken died, this time found among a bunch of scattered building materials with a chunk bitten out of its backside. More phantom flashlight beams shot out of the woods, sometimes white, sometimes blue, sometimes accompanied by the same shadowy forms that had become so familiar. Strange smells would drift over the property, sending pets like farm cats into a panic. There's a chilling reference towards the end of Night Siege. Dennis says that Robert admitted that there was some sort of linkage between one of his sons, these beings, and the UFOs. It isn't discussed much more than a passing reference to what seems like poltergeist activity in their home, and a series of finger-like impressions were discovered on a battered fuse box in the basement, like something with tremendous strength had tried to sabotage the family's electricity. Interestingly, a control panel that monitored Robert's gas pipeline was also found smashed in on 3 separate occasions. Other than that, exactly what link existed between Robert's son and the phenomena remains a mystery. There was one last experiment that Dennis, Robert, and the researchers conducted on the farm, and they decided to set a trap. Dennis wrote that it was fellow researcher Willard McIntyre's idea. Dennis said this:
In his letter, he suggested we try different lures and could try to get these creatures on film. He said he could bring tape recordings of ducks and of a rabbit screaming. Plus, he could bring 3 live rabbits that we would be staked out in some appropriate location, hoping the creatures would run out and try to get the rabbits. Inside the rabbits would be capsules of cyanide. These capsules could only be broken if the rabbit is eaten alive. We came back to Robert's property around 8 p.m. Willard and Larry got the rabbits ready. They were staked out in an open field, which we had Robert plow beforehand. The rabbits were tied with 1,200-pound test parachute cord, one end around a back foot and the other to a metal milk crate. A tape loop of rabbits screaming was prepped and used to try and attract these creatures.
Dennis said that around 9:30 that night, he and 4 others observing the trap from different angles spotted the red eyes in the woods, as many as 6 separate pairs at a time, as if they were ready to make a dash for the rabbits. But nothing ever happened. Everyone eventually went to bed. The next day, Dennis and Willard arrived on the property. No one had gone out to check the rabbits. When they arrived at the site of the trap, no one could believe their eyes. 1 rabbit had been taken. Another was gone as well. The milk crate it had been tethered to was found resting on its side. And the 1,200-pound parachute cord, it wasn't untied. It was snapped in 2 like it had been exploded out, something no human being could do. And sets of 5-toed footprints were found all around, mashed deep into the soil. And that's where the story ends, at least publicly. Dennis alludes to the fact that the story is ongoing, but we don't know much more beyond that. Now, recently, rumors have started circulating that Dennis's old tapes have resurfaced, offering hope that we might someday learn more about this case, which has to be one of the most dramatic encounters ever recorded. But until someone shares those with the public, we're all left wondering what exactly happened in Rome, Ohio in the summer of 1981. If it is authentic, and there's no reason to doubt it is, other than how intense the whole thing was, then the case chronicled in Dennis Pilich's Night Siege has the potential to completely reshape not only what we think we know about UFOs and Bigfoot, but also reality itself. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment below, "It's coming right for us!" So that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.